recognize the fact that it takes you 20 to clean the toilet, plus it's a disgusting job. So that's not the only way that we can end up exploiting ourselves and each other, but I'm just using that as a tool to get everybody to understand this. And one of the things that came out of the last talk that I think is really important is to recognize that we are all on a continuum. So there are going to be times that I'm going to end up exploiting you, and there are going to be times that I'm going to end up exploiting myself and treating myself in terms of these paradigms of domination, but that we can overcome it through having individual experiences with people. You know, so in the same way that by being friends, say, with, you know, I had a roommate who had a disability very close to, and I'm sorry I don't know the woman who was on the last panel's name. Sarah. But you know, so a lot of the things that she was talking about in terms of getting ready in the morning, I knew because I had helped at one point, you know, my roommate go through this. So, or at least been there, witnessed more so, but sometimes helped. Anyway, point being that as we have interconnections with each other and we are set to tasks together, like having to go to the grocery store for the occupation, then that's one of the ways in which we highlight our abilities, and we also highlight our equality in the sense that time is an asset that we all have equally, right? We all have 24 hours in this day. It's how we choose to use that time and what we do with it. And obviously, race and gender and class and ability are going to come into play with that, because if I have transportation, that's going to make me able to do a lot more in that 24 hours. Or if I have $20 in my pocket, that's going to be able to make me do a lot more with those 24 hours than I would if I didn't have $20 in my pocket. So the major thing that I actually want to talk about, and I wanted to do it as a round table, we'll see how we do on time, is that even though we are explicitly here to unite and represent the 99%, right? That's the message of the occupation, is that the 1% is dominating us, we are the 99%, and we need to throw off the shackles of the 1% and tell them to stop hoarding all of this wealth and help us to regain our own power, right? Because we are the source into our culture. So because we are a movement that is primarily about economic issues, it makes sense that class and socioeconomic status are going to become something that we ourselves internally have to struggle to overcome before we can overcome it externally on the macro level. Because the idea about these paradigms is that just because it's you and I interacting doesn't mean that I check those paradigms of domination at the door when I come to occupation. I still have it. I remember one story, somebody told me that there's this occupier, Chris, not very many people know him because, I don't know, I guess he kind of looks scary. But he came up to someone who was at GA, and she was just shivering and shuddering, right? And he came up behind her to put his coat on her, just, you know, trying to be very sweet, and she, pardon my language, freaked the fuck out. You know, it just really scared her that this person was behind her, you know, to her in a threatening way, putting this coat, who I don't know, maybe she thought was dirty or something, instead of seeing it as an act of kindness. And the idea is, well, you know, do I think that her political beliefs are totally solid? Yes. Does that mean that she's completely overcome every single class bias that she had prior to coming to occupation? Absolutely not. So the reason why occupation is a solution to all of these problems is threefold. First, the consensus process is not about domination in the way that the voting process is about domination. And you and I were talking a little bit about this earlier. The idea is when you vote, there are winners and there are losers, right? This is my proposal, and I'm really vested into having this proposal passed because I think it's the best proposal. And then if I don't win, right, if the group decides to go with another proposal, then I'm upset and offended because my proposal lost. So there's an us and a them inherent in the system, right? Liberal versus conservative, whatever. In the consensus process, the idea is, you know, Lainey brings a proposal, and it's an awesome proposal. And maybe we have some concerns with that proposal, but every single person's concerns are understood equally and given equal weight. And it's not until we've overcome all of those concerns that we go forward with coming to consensus. And if there's somebody who's saying, no, look, I have this really important concern that I don't think it's been met, then ideally, because it's not a vote, we don't go forward until that consensus patterns are equally valid and we all can come through it. So I think that that's one thing that occupation does that helps us to overcome these paradigms of oppression, is because we explicitly say, look, if you're somebody who talks a lot, step back. If you're somebody who doesn't get a chance to speak a lot, step forward. And that it's not just that, it's that the process itself is meant to say every voice is equally important. Every concern is equally important. And that it's not about, well, I want to get my way and I want to win. You know, just as an example, when we were talking about what to do with the finance working group, I sparkled for about 4 different proposals. And people were looking at me funny, like, aren't you only going to sparkle for your own proposal? And I'm like, well, that's the one that I think is best, but I'm equally fine with the other 3. And I think that that's something that really helps us to be able to overcome these paradigms. Secondly, I think physically occupying forces us to work together, and it forces us to really think about some of the other issues that Nolan was talking about in his discussion, or in y'all's discussion, I should say. For example, there's a difference between like minimum thriving thresholds, sort of survival thresholds, and then the ability to thrive. And for a lot of 24/7 occupiers, you know, I know that there was a big discussion about, are these people flying signs? Or are the signs being used as walls for shelter? And I personally was really upset when I saw people using signs as walls for shelter. I thought that that was really inappropriate. But then I'm having a conversation with Colin, and Colin says to me, well, wait a minute. Like, if there's a whole bunch of wind coming through, and it's been raining, and you need to use these as shelter, why is that a problem? Is that not a political statement that we have gotten to a point that these signs need to be used as shelter? And that really caused me to have a paradigm shift. You know, and I've had a lot of them in terms of spending my time with the 24/7 occupation, and really realizing that physically taking up a space means that you come to have conversations with people that get you to understand where they're coming from, and then that helps you to understand, well, what exploitative paradigms am I bringing to this issue? Go ahead.
It brings you around a bunch of people that maybe otherwise you wouldn't have before because of your comfort zone. You would have maybe avoided or other things like that. That's been one of the most beautiful things that I think has come out of this conversation. I fully support that.
Yeah, I'm glad. Does anybody else want to add something, by the way?
Well, it's not even that always we avoid it. It's just that we really are set up to not. You have to actively attempt, and that itself can be exploitive. Like if I go and seek out a homeless person to talk to, that's a little weird, you know. So it's like just a natural opportunity that you don't get very often because that's the way society is set up. You know, that's intentional.
Right, and it is. I think it's really important for us to remember that this is a tool of oppression that the 1% uses explicitly, because we've seen them do it historically over and over and over again. I mean, this is definitely part of their bag of tricks. And we don't check it at the door when we come to occupation. We carry it with us. And one of the other things that occupation does, I think, is to push us to be more folk. And I decide I'm going to start growing my own food in my backyard. And then as I'm growing my own food, I start to have an appreciation for the land and environmental concerns. And how is the land being used and exploited? Because that's the same paradigm that allows you to exploit a person is the same paradigm that allows you to exploit the land. The ecofeminists do a really good job of talking about how precisely that happens. That basically the same paradigm that makes you think, oh, look at this beautiful woman, like I just want to fuck her and get between her legs and not care what's going on with her, is the same paradigm that lets me look at like a lovely little creek and say, oh, I can go in and build a mill here and make it really ugly and, you know, put in a whole bunch of toxic processes, and it's okay for me to use this land in this way, instead of thinking of myself as being in a cooperative, self-sustaining relationship with this land or with this person or with this product or whatever it is.
Recently, this week, someone posted that there was a company down at Southby, Southwest, that is hiring homeless people as hotspots. And it was kind of on its face, it seems really distasteful. It bothers our sensibilities as people who have a place to sleep and use a refrigerator at night. But my immediate thought was, has anybody asked the homeless people how they think about this? So I made it a point to ask a fellow, I won't mention his name, but you all know who he is. And he said, I didn't hear about that. I'd be up for that. He needs change in his pocket. He knows where to get food in the morning, but he needs coffee money and cigarette money, and he's not doing anything anyway, so he would be up for it. So that's that paradigm shift that you're talking about, the difference between different points of view.
You have to be really careful with a couple of different things. So first of all, let me say, one thing that I have come to understand, the people on the steps are not a monolithic group. Homeless people are not a monolithic group.
Any more than we are.
There is a huge difference between a lot of the people that I've met, all of whom fall under the general umbrella of homelessness. So tokenism is something we have to be really careful with. The other problem is also that these paradigms of domination become internalized. So, like, if you talk to a prostitute and you say, are you being exploited by your sex work, she's probably going to say no. Because if she admits to being exploited, that's going to cause all sorts of internalized things going on with her. But does that mean that she's not actually being exploited?
Right.
Not necessarily.
Right.
So we need to be really careful, because it may be the case that there are times that I exploit myself.
Right.
And that I exploit my loved ones, and I don't realize it, because these paradigms are so ingrained within me that I don't kick them. And I think that that's something that's really, really hard to understand, is just because, you know, that person A is homeless does not mean that person A understands the best solution to the homelessness problem. It may be that somebody who is not homeless but stands in solidarity has better access to education and access to all of these other things. Like, let me give you a really explicit example. I think that the only solution that's going to work in Austin for ending homelessness is lifting the camping ban. And that's something that I've been talking to a lot of people about as much as I can. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, we've talked to people who are homeless, and they themselves would rather have a women's shelter. And it's hard for me to say, how do I respond to that? Because I don't want to come in and be like, well, I'm an educated white person, and I know better. But at the same time, I also want to say a women's shelter is not actually going to fix the problem, and it isn't the right solution. So how do we do that? And the nice thing, going back to the consensus process, is that in a consensus process we can say, well, we're just trying to raise awareness, and so as long as we're raising awareness, regardless of which issue we're focusing on, awareness is being raised, that's good enough. Or we can say, well, we're going to have a ranked list of priorities, but we're going to make sure that all of these issues are also being
negative of being exploited kind of keeps you from seeing the light, the yin to the yang or whatever, of living your life in service of others, and just saying, you know what, everyone's exploiting everyone. That's just kind of how in this service I can say, okay, I'm going to serve others, I'm going to serve you, but I'm going to do it on my terms, you know? I think it's, you know, and that's, I think why, you know, to get biblical about it, but like Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and he was just like, she's a prostitute, you know, and she like wept and cleaned his feet, and he forgave her, and just kind of this sort of like realization that, you know, her heart was open and she wanted to be of service. And I think it's the same way with a lot of people. It's just like they're all trying to do the best they can and trying to focus on what they can do. And I feel like concentrating on exploitation sometimes gets you to the point where you're looking for it coming at you all the time, you know?
I think there's definitely a danger in that, and I think that you're really right to bring it up. I was talking to somebody who's kind of a long-term activist, and he said that usually activists kind of break down into two camps. One is kind of I want to help an individual person, right? Like, my active service is I want to go and work in a food kitchen, and I fed 50 people today, and I get to be, you know, to feel like I did something right. And then there's the second branch, which is system, which is talking about, well, here are the systems that cause these problems, and we need to deal with that root problem. And I think these are seen as being antagonistic by most activists. And one of the things that I really love about Occupy is that I can come in and feed people, and then I can turn around and do a teach-in like this, and I see them as being interconnected. So, like, I really feel like if I come to you and I say, like, oh, I want to cook a meal for Nolan because he's blind and he needs my help, that's a very different conversation than saying, like, I want to invite Nolan to have dinner with me because he's my friend. And when we think about these paradigms in terms of like our own situation, thinking like, oh, these people are exploiting Occupy Offset because we're feeding them and we are giving them a safe and dry place to be. And now that we're in month 5, I'm actually starting to come to the conclusion that maybe Occupy Austin exploited the homeless population, and that the reason why we have this narrative that says that they were exploiting us, air quotes, all abound, is because we don't want to think about the possibility that, quote, we were, quote, exploiting them. And I think any time that you catch yourself using us versus them language, that's a really big bell that should go off. Like, if you, as a, quote, GAer, catch yourself talking about a, quote, 24/7, think about why is it that you think that this division is there, and what can we do to overcome it? Because if we're serious about this notion that we are the 99%, and that we're trying to represent the entirety of the 99%, then obviously those of us who are in the lowest socioeconomic echelon are going to be the ones that feel the problems of the 1% most strongly, which means that we are going to be the ones that are most likely to fight against it, because it has become a life or death issue for you if you're living on the street in a way that it isn't if you have a roof and a refrigerator.
Like, for example, I'm a mom, so 90% of my energy goes to my son. And I don't see it as, like, being exploited or losing anything. I see it as service, you know, and I see it as, like, I'm doing this because I choose to, and, you know, and I think even the example of, like, the homelessness population and the Occupy kind of being this synergistic thing, maybe they both serve each other, and maybe it doesn't have to be, like, a confrontational exploitation relationship, you know what I mean?
Well, I think ideally we'll get to a point where we can cooperate with each other without exploitation being a concern, you know, but like, I don't really see my experience, but like we're looking for a place, right, and like, I make money, and right now he so much doesn't, and so we're trying to figure out, like, how are we going to set up even just the microcosm of our household in a way where I don't end up exploiting his labor, and that he doesn't end up feeling resentful of the fact that my labor earns more money than his. And we're still trying to figure out, like, on a practical level, how are we going to do that? Like, finding a house, obviously, like, a larger and more pressing concern, but it's still something that I think when you talk about it explicitly, this is one of those issues where I think that the more you raise awareness, the more you can ask yourself, like, well, so I'm spending all this time with my son, and I love doing it because he's my child and I chose to have children, and I don't see it as being exploitative at all. But maybe if I think about it from the perspective of, could it be that he's somehow exploiting me, just asking that question might get you to rephrase, like, what sorts of things are you doing as a mom? Like, it may turn out that maybe the best thing for you to do and for your son to do is for you to do, like, a one-day women's retreat so that you can feed your soul and be better nourished so that you can take better care of him as well. But you might say, well, I can't do that because I have to take care of him, and then you start to feel resentful. And I think that also plays into this exploitation, is that it helps people, look, you start to feel resentful, like, well, my work is not being recognized, my contribution is being recognized, I'm not seen as a person, and maybe that person didn't intend to exploit you. So by having an explicit conversation, you can both get to a better cooperative place. Like, I'm not going to lie to you guys, in terms of beating the 1%, like, I think that the solution is really clear. We all become self-sufficient and interconnected, cooperative, to the point that they no longer make money off us. Like, we are the source of all their wealth. Our labor is the source of all their wealth. So if we work for each other, and we profit share for each other, and we say to you 1%ers, like, if you're not willing to put in sweat, you don't get anything out, period. And the moment that you quit putting in sweat, you quit getting something out and fill your pension, that's really important. So we can shift our economics to a point where it becomes obvious that these people are parasitic. And it becomes obvious that the paradigms of domination that they are bombarding us with, between television, radio, all of this stuff, right? Like Kim Kardashian, why is she a model? All she does is consume and use people. You know, and like in terms of the home example, you know, like one solution that you could come to, you know, let's say that you're both like white middle class people and you earn $60,000 a year each. And you decide, well, I'm tired of fighting over who does the household labor, we're going to outsource it. Okay, well, if that outsourcing then goes to a brown woman who is illegal and has no worker protections and is getting paid $6 an hour to clean my house, then I haven't dealt with the problem of exploitation. I've just taken that football and passed it off to somebody.
It's time. And so that's why I think it's good to ask these questions. Like, well, let's take the question and reverse it. Did Occupy Austin exploit the homeless instead of asking, did the homeless exploit Occupy Austin? And then people are going to start to say, well, wait a minute, like, which one? Like, who is this, quote, the homeless,
Right.
of which we speak? Because the reality of the situation is that that's no more a monolithic group than women or blacks or people with disabilities or whatever group you want to mention. Underprivileged population by definition. I'm also a really strong feminist, and recently I have come to the conclusion that, I guess I'm on my stream, but I'll go ahead and say it. That government really is the source of all of this strife. Thomas Hobbes talks a lot about this idea that those in power then write laws, and then those laws in turn dictate morality. Like, I'm not going to have this conversation while smoking a joint because the powers that be say that that is illegal. And because it's illegal, some of you are going to find it to be immoral in a way that if there wasn't a law there, you wouldn't, right? So the idea is that you use power to build these structures. And then once these structures are there, they dictate our morality, they dictate our interactions. And just to give you like one final comment before we go into listening to the band, like, structures are really insidious, and I think it's important, we can think of them in terms of physical architecture. And that's part of the reason why I wanted us to all sit outside and have this conversation. Because when you're in a building, right, especially in a classroom, when I usually have these conversations with people, class gets out at 3. So I can guarantee that you're not going to get up and leave until 3 and until I stop talking. And that when you do get up and leave, you're going to go through a door. You're not going to try to go out the window. You're not going to go out through the wall or anything along those lines, right? Now, you have free will. Technically speaking, you could jump up at any time now and start mic checking me or screaming or doing whatever you want or wandering off or whatever. But you're probably not going to. And as this structure imposes itself on you because you're born into it, it changes the kind of decisions that you make. So as a woman, your door might be different than it is as a man. As a white person, your door might be different than if you're a Hispanic person, or whatever your particular structures are. So you still have free will, but I can guarantee you that you're only going to go out through the door at a specific time, and that's usually the way that it's going to be. So when we think about race and gender and class and disability and ability and age as being these kinds of structures, it helps us to be able to see, well, how am I limited in my ability to live freely? You know, if I'm somebody who said, well, I'm going to give up everything and spend the next 120 days on the steps, I probably don't have a phone. So I might want to tweet from the 24/7 occupation. Like, I remember this was a big deal. My friend Erin was like, well, I have a phone, I just can't pay my bill right now. And I really would like to be able to do tweeting at night so that people who are not 24/7ers can know that this is a third shift operation. Like, if you see people sleeping on the steps during the day, that's because most of what is going on in the 24/7 occupation is happening between 9 p.m. and 6 o'clock in the morning. So it makes sense that people are sleeping during the day. And it was actually an issue. Like, I was trying to get him the money so that he could pay his phone bill so that he could tweet. And I couldn't managed to get my hands on it. Now, I could have just taken it out of my own pocket, but the point that I'm trying to make in this conversation is that we really need to think about what does it mean to be free. And to be free requires certain basic conditions to be met, like food and shelter and transportation and education and healthcare. And if all of us have those things, then we can use that as a launching point to do other things. But the problem is, if we all have them, the 1% couldn't profit from us for selling those things to us. So they want to make sure that we're exploiting each other and ourselves. So, kind of getting back to your point from earlier, I really think that it's not until we overcome the paradigm that says, well, I'm going to make $20 an hour off you, but I'm only going to pay you $10 because I want to have a nice boat at the end of the year. Until we get over that, we're not going to be able to do anything else. And I do believe that it's possible for us to come to instantaneous, spontaneous order and just slowly but surely shift our society away from these paradigms of domination. But we have to understand that we are born into this physical structure, and we don't see it. We think we're outside, but we carry it within us internally. You all have a house of oppression within you. I do too. And it's only by having consciousness-raising conversations with people over and over and over again. You know, one teaching is not going to do it. I could do this every day for the next year, and I would be closer to where I want to be, but I'm not going to be where I want to be. And these experiences, Paulo Freire talks about it in terms of conscientização, basically the word for when you come to understand the ironies within the system that keep you oppressed. And it's not until you feel them within your own bones, even the ones that don't personally oppress you but oppress others. And when you start to get really angry instead of feeling ashamed, like I think the other tool of oppression that people undervalue is I talk to so many people who we can't find foreclosure victims right now. We're trying to advocate for them at bank action, we can't find them. And when we do talk to them, they're ashamed. Like they really think like they've done something wrong, and that's the reason why they're being foreclosed upon, or that's the reason why they're homeless. Instead of being angry that these structures are trying to dominate us and saying, no, wait a minute, this is not cool.
So, these guys are waiting for us
to
come in and be an audience and continue. We're going to start running into a problem with the bands conflicting if we don't kind of get them started pretty soon. So I don't wanna...